I'm Dr. Ryan Holsapple.
And I'm Karen Johnson. And this is the Self Soul Spirit podcast. Today we're going to do an introduction to the Self Soul Spirit model.
Yep, the Self Soul Spirit model founded by Dr. Strachan in 1973. Our last episode was a brief introduction to who we are. And now the podcast will be exploring briefly self, soul, and spirit as an overall introduction to the model as a whole. Following episodes will be a deeper explication on each of the three categories: self, soul, and spirit. In essence, we'll do deep dives. This is a really important introduction because without this, the following conversations don't have the ground. And this podcast is going to have a lot of deep explorations of themes, of character studies, of topics about life that we apply with the Self-Soul Spirit model through the lens of the Self-Soul Spirit model. So therefore, we have to set the foundation for our audience to understand what it is that we're talking about. So we're going to start with self, and then we're going to work our way into spirit. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay. Anything you want to add to that?
No thing to add. The podcast that will follow, where we'll have themes, are going to be really the application of the model. And today will be the groundwork for, the different words we use and terms we use.
You want me to launch into self?
Yeah.
Self. We talked a little bit about, in the basic introduction, subpersonalities. And now I'm going to give you the scientific, philosophical, and phenomenological approach that we use for subpersonalities. Now, you will notice in the literature, if you study subpersonalities, there are many different concepts about parts, meaning different parts of the self, different coping styles, different personality traits, different subpersonalities, different personas, different selves, different subselves. For the last 200 years in psychology, so many people have done a deep dive on the psyche. The common theme in these studies is that we are not just one thing, that we are multiple. There are scientific reasons for that are embedded in our evolutionary history as a species. Because we evolved as complex human organisms, we have multiple modes of adaptation that are designed to meet their own needs. In evolutionary psychology, we might talk about pair bonding, caregiving, acquisition, play, child rearing, hunting and gathering, protection, aggression, shelter, etc. In essence, we are designed to seek multiple modes of engagement because as organisms get more complex from an evolutionary perspective, they also have more parts. Those parts have a design, those parts have a purpose. Subpersonalities follow from our evolutionary history. The important thing to understand is that we are all unique, that there are no two human beings alike, that evolution is a model that we use to understand the way that the species develops, and yet we understand that there's really no such thing as the species as such. It's all done through individuals. Another way of saying that is the species is a category of what we are as humans. We share 99% of the same genes, yet it's that 1% of the genes that we don't share that make us unique and actually lead to a tremendous difference in terms of the way that we behave, the way that we feel, what we find valuable. To capture that just a little more for you, there is evidence that shows that we share about roughly 96% of our genetics with chimpanzees. Okay? So we share about 50% of genetics with bananas. So just think about that for a second. A little bit of a difference in genetic makeup makes a huge difference in terms of outcome, in terms of characteristics, in terms of traits. So while Karen and I were both part of the human species, we share a lot of the same genes. We also, being unique, have these diverging paths of who we are. And I have subpersonalities that she doesn't have. She has subpersonalities that I don't have. Would you add anything to that so far?
Not yet.
Not
keep
yet.
going.
I'll keep
You're
launching.
doing great.
Then, from there, we say this. Even identical twins are unique. We know from research that when the zygote splits, they develop similar and different genetic profiles. We know from twin studies in behavioral genetics that if you separate twins, which were adopted at birth, and you study them over a lifetime, you raise them in different households, right? You adopt them, separate them in different households. In the family environment, all things considered, is safe and has mutual respect and is not an abusive household, right? They will develop tremendous convergences in personality. Just a quick pause on this video. I meant to have said identical twins develop a tremendous similarity through the study of personality in that they are raised in different households. Fraternal twins are no more similar than regular siblings. So it's quite crucial to make that distinction. So in genetic studies, this is called heritability. Heritability is a bit of a weird term because it does not mean inheritance. It means to what we can attribute within genetics the differences between each other. So if something has a heritability of 50%, that means 50% of the difference between people on this particular trait is attributed to genetics. It doesn't mean that 50% of these genes, that 50% of your genes make this trait or something like that. An important thing to add is it also doesn't mean that 50% of a given trait is attributable to genetics. You wouldn't say, my athlete subpersonality is 50% genetic. That doesn't make sense. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why it doesn't make sense later when we get into the nature of nurture. Nature and nurture can't just be separated. They're a continuum. You can't separate your genes from your environment. You develop within an environment. They're symbiotic. Okay, back to the concept of heritability. It means that 50% of the differences between people. So it's a statistical measure. Honestly, I'm going to leave it to the side and focus more on the uniqueness. All you need to know is that we are able to extrapolate from the data that we are all unique. Dr. Strachan knew this very early on. He was a geneticist, dyed in the wool, and was way ahead of the field of psychology in terms of genetics. He knew that we brought in these traits, that we were not born as a blank slate, like the old philosopher John Locke used to say, and that these traits develop through the nurturing experiences. But they don't develop passively, they develop proactively. And what that means is that the genes we bring in are a part of the nurturing of themselves. The environment is what's available, the environment is the condition, and the way we accommodate to those conditions depends on our genetics. So the environment is tremendously important for our human development, because if we do grow up in an abusive household, or we grow up in a particular ecology, or we grow up in a particular culture, what does that do? It sets the parameters for what's possible, and it gives feedback to me as an individual about how I'm going to be able to interact with that environment. Now, given the fact that I'm not a single voice, that I have multiple subpersonalities as a self, I'm going to perceive my environment through the filter of my subpersonalities. Now, how does it work then? If I have all these parts, how do they engage in behavior? Well, the human system works like this. There's only so much energy in the psyche, and Strachan attributes this to Freud, that we can only have so many different parts active in behavior at once, one or two. The reason for this is that we don't have an unlimited resource of energy. We have a life force, we have an energy source, and that energy source has to get filtered through the channel of our human confines, our human constraints, our human organism. So when we have a subpersonality that takes over, it takes over because it can. It takes over because it has a desire system and it wants to. And it takes over because there is a stimulus in the environment that it's attracted to or that it wants to get away from, or that it has its own agenda to find something that it wants. The thing that we often don't realize is that because we have these subpersonalities, we might leave an environment because it doesn't have the conditions we want. So if I'm a scholar and if I have a scholar subpersonality and my parents want me to stay home and work the farm and they don't want me to go to school, well, if that scholar is strong enough genetically, I might just leave. So we don't look at the environment as a static condition. We look at ourselves as having a say in what the environment is. And that if we don't like something, if we don't like cold weather, we'll move to warmer weather. Okay? So the idea is that we accommodate to what we want, or otherwise we are accepting or tolerating something because that's where the energy is. That's where our subpersonalities are. Another crucial point here is that we honor and understand the worldly limitations that can be set in a given situation. If you are right now living in Ukraine in a war zone, despite your subpersonality's desire to leave that situation, there might be real obstacles. So we understand that the constraints that we face and the possibilities that we face are also a moving target. It's fluid. The point that I'm trying to make to you is that subpersonalities are proactive. They don't just simply receive information. As Dr. Strachan made it very clear to me in my training, they accommodate. They don't just assimilate. And I'll show an image of subpersonalities up on the screen so you can start to visualize the different parts of who we are, the different ways in which this can work. For those of you who are listening on audio only, look in the description of your podcast where you will see a public access link so you can view the photos of our mandalas on Google Drive. For those of you who are watching, you will see the mandalas right here on the screen. As you will see in the image, the soul is always in the middle. This goes back to Carl Jung's work on mandalas. Carl Jung, being a preeminent psychologist that studied the depths of the human psyche, was interested in cross-cultural symbols, which is to say, things that don't just depend on the relative customs and social frameworks of a given society or a given ethnicity, but that which transcends culture and seems to get into the universal. Well, as Dr. Strachan taught me, one of the universal symbols is the circle. The circle really represents the mandala, the totality. For those of you who aren't really familiar with what a mandala is, I recommend you look it up online. Mandalas are images of wholeness that are tapestries that have beautiful artistic value, but also very deep mythological, psychological, and symbolic value. In a mandala, you always have multiple figures, multiple designs, multiple patterns that essentially form around a center. The mandala, being the circle of wholeness, is the container for the center, for the soul of who you are. Your mandala is yourself and your soul combined. Your mandala is you. We will get into the soul later in this episode. For now, all you need to know is the mandala is a symbol of wholeness that represents the human psyche. Dr. Strachan left off from where Jung was, and he took the mandala and he personalized it, understanding that now we are not just dealing with universal symbols, but deeply personal understandings of your human uniqueness. So we each have our own mandala, the soul and all the subpersonalities. We use this word I. I'm Ryan. I'm a research psychologist who specializes in subpersonalities. And I'm here with my partner, Karen, right? So we use this word I, and we use it as if it's a single voice, it's a single thing, it's constrained to me, I, Ryan, right? So we dissect that in our model, and what we realize is that, wait a second, there's multiple I's. The part of me that's doing this podcast is not the same part of me that's going to be hanging out watching basketball games later on the couch. Now, if you ask that part of me, the wild bear, the 6-year-old boy, the athlete, whoever it might be, If you ask them about their interest in the podcast, they'll say, we can do the podcast another day.
Yeah.
I think I'd rather go do this. So there's I, right? I is a verb. It's a process by which subpersonalities come in and out of first-person experience. I is a way of getting control over behavior. I is related to metacognition. What is metacognition? Well, cognition is our process of thought, emotion, ideation. And metacognition is the self-awareness of that process. It's the ability to reflect. It's the ability for the self to say, here I am, here's what I am thinking. It's explicit awareness. Cognition is always going on. Consciousness is always going on. But when we get into metacognition, metaconsciousness, that's where we have the I. So the I, think of the I as a revolving door. Coming in and out of the revolving door are different parts, different subpersonalities. The ones that are keep in mind the energy limits, right? In that revolving door, there's only a few spots in there, right? So we can only really have a couple of these subpersonalities really in behavior at once. Who are you talking to right now? Who do you think you're talking to, Karen?
Oh, yeah, I was wondering who is here with us. Who is the I? Definitely your facilitator, teacher, and your scientist.
Yes, you're talking to my philosopher. You're talking to my teacher, and my facilitator's here supporting because he's the one who does the therapeutic process with clients, right? The teacher and the philosopher are getting heavy. So we are the ones, we step in, we say what we want to say, we have a model, and we're passionate about it. So you're getting a subpersonality right now. Now, well, the other important thing with all this, Karen, actually, before I do that, who are you right now? Who are you showing up with?
I'm showing up. My I is my goddess, which is she loves to hold the space, and also my facilitator teacher are here.
Great.
Yep.
And you've merged your facilitator and teacher so
yeah,
that they're
it's one. Yeah.
Say a little more about that.
So sometimes what we can know about these subpersonalities is they're very dynamic. They're not a static energy, and they can be very full. And so when I named my subpersonalities in my mandala that Ryan will show up on the screen, they can be really dynamic. And my facilitator teacher, she comes in as one entity, one personality. It didn't feel right to me to separate them into two different parts.
So be the facilitator teacher and tell us who you are and what makes you unique.
That's a great question. I am the facilitator teacher. I am here to teach the wisdom I have within and to facilitate spaces for others to access that wisdom within.
Absolutely. And in our last episode, in our introduction, you listened to what she does, whether it be women's groups or nature fasts. This is who this person is, this facilitator teacher. This is her passion. This is her calling. You're talking to the philosopher. I love big ideas, and I love getting those ideas into cohesive structures. I love analysis. I love critical thinking. I love learning about the universe. I love learning about consciousness. I love learning about subpersonalities. I love learning about life. I love learning about theology. I am immersed in the process of education. As the teacher, I like teaching it.
Yeah.
As a philosopher, I like soaking it all in, thinking about it, and thinking for myself, right? Actually exercising my ability to think. And as the teacher, I love to present. Roger told me, Dr. Strachan, he said, Ryan, you're good at learning and performing. You learn it and then you perform it. And that's who I am. I learn it and then I perform it. If I'm not interested in it, I don't really learn it.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people, and this leads into my other subpersonalities. I only do what I want to do.
Yeah.
There are those individuals genetically that are highly compulsive, that are highly individualized, that are strong, independent people, that they have the force of their own person is high, right? And there are others that are more accommodating or more, they'll put up with things. And I tend to have to be strongly motivated inside to do something. Now, what does that mean? Well, if I'm a husband, it's because I want to be a really loving husband, which is authentic to my lover part, my romantic lover. If I'm an athlete, it's because I really want to get out there and run. So I'm operating on this process of authenticity of what I want. It doesn't mean that I don't do compromise. Mm-hmm. It means that I learn the process of compromise through wanting it. Mm-hmm. I don't do obligation well at all.
And what you're showing right now is that we don't get rid of these genetics. They're with us our whole life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Robert Plowman, one of the perhaps the most preeminent behavioral geneticists in the world, calls this the nature of nurture. That we can't just look at these heritability studies in isolations and look at ourselves statistically. Statistics talk about no one in particular. Okay? In Self, Soul, Spirit, we don't do nomothetic, we do ideographic. What's the difference? Let's talk about that. Nomothetic is studying how people are alike and studying groups, right? Ideographic is studying individuals. Ideographic is applied. Mm-hmm. The nature of nurture means that as I develop, I am proactively engaged with my environment. There's no such thing as separating my genetics from my neurology, from my personality, from my behavior. They're not islands of isolation. So we see nature and nurture as this fluid, interconnected thing. This old debate that we used to have, nature versus nurture. Every sophisticated personality scientist, every sophisticated behavioral geneticist does not see a dichotomy. You ask me, does the environment matter? Of course it matters. Why? Because that's where I am. Okay? It's like, that's what is giving me my options. If somebody comes in and gets into an abusive situation, let's say I'm a toddler and somebody's hitting me, of course that's going to affect me. The question is how. Mm-hmm. How it affects me depends on who I am. Dr. Strachan tells his story. His story is, as a child, he had an abusive stepfather. Now, did he bring in a victim?
Nope.
No, he brought in a warrior genetically. He didn't bring in any victim parts. And by the way, victim is validated in the literature that it is brought in genetically. There's not a value judgment with that. That's the other part of this model. When we identify the subpersonalities, we don't get into values.
Yes, and that can be one of the most healing parts of our model from my experience working with women's groups, is to have the freedom to name these parts without having to feel like we have to hide a certain part of who we are, because we have a cultural shame about it, or we have an internal shame about it. Like, for instance, I have a part I call the good girl, and it can feel like, I don't know if I want to name that. The freedom and the healing and the work, it comes from naming. We will talk a lot about awareness in the work we do, and it's the value judgments I believe is one of the foundational freeing parts of this model, is that there is no value judgment. There's no good or bad. We say it is what it is. It's what we do with it that matters. It is what it is. I have a good girl. I have a sensitive part. I will always have those genetic parts with me.
What is it that makes them unique?
Unique.
Yeah, who are they?
I, the sensitive, am a feeler. I feel other people's emotions. I feel my emotions deeply. I used to feel not capable of handling those emotions, and a part of my journey as the sensitive has been learning how to navigate those waters. And so I, the sensitive, also get to feel great emotions like joy and passion and the preciousness of life. And so I have a lot of energy when I'm in that space. I, the good girl, am here to please, and as the good girl, I am a dynamic part. And so as the model shows, my whole mandala it's a lifelong process, right? We're never like arriving anywhere. I'm never going to get to a place where I'm like, I am perfect and all my parts are exactly how I want them to be. And so just last night, Ryan and I were doing work with my good girl part to bring her in a place of more functionality, which we will talk a lot about as well. The whole point of our work is to name what is functional for us as a whole entity, a whole mandala, and what do I need to do to get to that functionality. If a part's not being functional, then what can I do? What is my first awareness of how that part's not being functional? And then what's my action I can do to create a functionality in my life that will support me where I want to go?
Perfectly stated.
Yeah.
Yeah, functionality is the key with this model. And we also use another word, authenticity. That we are invited to own our process. That when we get rid of the societal, cultural baggage of should do this, shouldn't do that, it's good to have this kind of income, it's good to have this kind of family, it's good to have this kind of house, it's good to have this kind of situation, it's good to have an education. All of these things that we take in, yet are they really us, right? Where do they come from? Where do they land inside of us? How do we engage with them? Have we truly engaged with them authentically, or have we just let them float around in our system without asking the question, is this me? Do I want this? What part of me wants this? Then once we do that, we get the separation. We get the space from the judgments to see who we are. We can't, when we're in the judgments, we can't see ourselves. We're not engaging us, we're engaging ideas about what life should be. So I talk about needs, and I talk about wants, and I talk about shoulds. Those are the three categories of our value systems. Needs, we have needs for our survival, we have needs for our well-being. Wants, we have desires, we have things we want. We might not need them, we want them. we want them, and those come from our those values come from our subpersonalities. Then we have shoulds. Well, that's part of being a part of a culture and a society, is that, hey, pull your weeds. Think about that. That's just how it works. Hey, do this, get this degree, go to school. Hey, be a mother, whatever it is. Now, we have to wrestle with those as individuals, and we make the choice about what we want or need, so that the shoulds get sloughed off. That they're not really engaging, they're not really taking over our psyches. So a big part of this model is get rid of the shoulds, get rid of that. In Gestalt, they call them introjects. Get them out of here, and just engage from this place of authenticity of who are you and what do you want. Now, there might be certain subpersonalities that take on those shoulds. And then the question becomes, well, is that what you want?
Yeah.
And if they say, yes, I want that, then it moves from should to want. So then you get rid of the should either way. So in this model, if we're operating well, the shoulds don't exist.
Yeah, and how freeing is that?
How freeing is that?
Yeah.
I want to also be sensitive to the fact that teaching about the genetics of personality, it is a lot for people who are new to it. In our culture, some of you have been exposed to the idea that life makes you who you are. It's very ingrained for some people. We always have a story.
Yes.
I ended up this way because this happened. If Dr. Strachan says, my mom took my doll away and that's why I'm all screwed up. We always have a story about why we are the way we are, and we base it in events. My challenge to you, the listener, is consider the possibility that that's not true, that the story isn't really the reason, that the story is an event, that we play ourselves out on the stage of life, that we are already a character. We don't become who we are who we are. Now, we become, through the process of neurological development, we engage certain neural pathways, and we strengthen certain traits that we brought in genetically. We do become, yet we don't become different than who we already are. We become who we are. We become who we already are. We engage. So let's go back to Dr. Strachan's warrior. Stepfather's beating him. Doesn't have a victim part. Warrior says, when I'm old enough, just wait.
Yeah.
The warrior is going to kick this guy's butt. That's his mindset. Now, whether or not the other parts of Roger let him, that's a discussion for another time. That's a battle between wills of whether or not he's going to get away with it, which he didn't, by the way. He didn't let himself go down the vengeful path. That's part of the beauty of his story, which we will drop on podcasts, and we will actually drop clips of him telling that story. But the point is that he grew into the warrior from this place of what's happening around him. Now, would he have had a warrior if he grew up in another household with a loving stepfather? Yes, he would have had a warrior. Would the warrior have developed as strongly? Probably not. He's admitted that to me. That when life challenges us with certain things, we respond with what's inside of us. We respond based on who we are. That's the nature and the nurture. The nature and the nurture. I'm the nature, then what's happening, and I engage that process. You think we covered that?
Yeah, and I would add one more piece is that what Ryan's alluding to as well is when we make up stories or say this is happening because of this, we're giving our power away. And a part of naming these subpersonalities within us is taking our power back for functionality, for how we want to be living our lives.
We want to move out of excuses and
Yes.
into authenticity.
Yes.
And part of that is no making up reasons. We ask me, why are you doing this podcast?
Why are you doing this podcast,
Because
Ryan?
I feel like it.
Great.
My philosopher feels like it. My teacher feels like it, because I want to be engaged in it.
Yes.
There's no story. It's not because this happened and that happened. It's authentic. Okay? Why did I get angry? Because I felt like it. The challenger in me, who's a part of me that gets angry, he felt like getting angry. I did. So Roger says humans are the only species that does exactly what they want to do at any given moment and then makes up a story about why they did it. No other species does that. Every other species just does exactly what they want to do, and they offer no explanations. We are the only species that uses the stories. Now, why is that? Well, that comes from the evolution of our brain, and it has been studied that there's a part of the brain that seeks to constantly make sense of everything. Now, one of the coolest things about understanding this is that in colostomy patients, those are patients who have their left and right hemispheres split. What happens in those patients is that the part of the brain that tells the story tries to make sense of the other parts of the being that act. So the way the brain works is it's cross-connected. The left hemisphere connects to the right side of your right eye, and the right hemisphere connects to your left eye. So if you split the hemispheres, if you split the corpus callosum, you now have more of a communication breakdown. And you're not able to, the right and the left hemisphere aren't able to communicate about what's going on. You still get the visual cross connection. So what happens is, if you split that person's visual field, so you want to talk to the left hemisphere, you'd hold something up in the right eye, right? If you want to talk to the right hemisphere, you'd hold something up in the left eye. And they've shown that the consciousness disassociates. Now, the reason for that isn't because the brain holds all the subpersonalities. The brain mediates the subpersonalities. The subpersonalities are the genetics, and the brain is the vehicle for the consciousness to be in a cohesive organismic framework. So what happens is if I split your visual field and I say to your left hemisphere, or if I say to your right hemisphere, pick up that glass of water. So go ahead and do it. Just for fun, just for the audience. Okay, now put it back down. Now if I go to the other side of the hemisphere and I say, why did you pick up that glass of water? What do these patients say in these studies? The left hemisphere says, oh, I thought you might be thirsty. Now think about that for a second. It's because the communication has broken down. Now what's happening is the brain is desperately looking for a reason. I thought you might be thirsty. No. What if you tell the person, well, actually, I just told you to pick it up? So the dissonance there is we actually believe our stories.
Yes.
But we know scientifically, we have the evidence that the stories are post hoc contrivances. We do what we want to do, then we tell why. Now, it's not that we don't engage. It's not that we don't have authentic engagement of, hey, I hugged you because I love you. That's different. It's that when we try to explain something after the fact, we have this part of us that makes it up. That's part of the human species, the storyteller, you could call it. That's a really important part of this model.
Yeah, and I am also a teacher in our school systems in America, and just seeing how deeply ingrained this goes in our culture. You could just watch my 8 and 9-year-olds for a day, and if they're doing something like throwing a pencil across the room, and I'll be like, that's not what we do in this classroom, immediately their reply will be, well, so-and-so did it too, or just like instant story, instead of just simply stating, yeah, I threw it across the room because I wanted to.
That's what I want to do.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it starts really young, and it's just pervasive. And what I hear Ryan saying is that it is important to name that in this work.
Yeah, and you're naming the cultural part of it, which is we reinforce the storytelling part of the brain.
Yes.
That wants to have a reason for everything,
yes.
by always asking for a reason for everything.
Oh, yeah.
Why'd you do that?
Yeah, why'd you do
when
that?
kids mess up, what do parents say?
Why'd you thinking?
That? What were you thinking?
Instead of just saying, we don't do...
So it almost becomes shameful not to have a reason.
That's a good point.
We shame each other into reasoning.
Yeah.
So the freedom of our model is you don't have to give excuses, you don't have to give reasons. You can be you and realize that you are a complex, spiritual, genetic, soulful organism that has, all this neurological development that just does things and has different parts that want different things. And they don't all have to see the world the same way. That's the other part of this that's powerful. My philosopher doesn't have to somehow see the world as my lover. And they might want to have a different plan for the afternoon. My wife might want me to come hang out with her, and my philosopher might want to work on his latest research paper. So it's about choice. And this is where we get into soul. The reason that we call our business Center for Creative Choice is because the soul is the source of free will. The subpersonalities are doing what they're doing, and the soul is our seat of consciousness. It's the depth of who we are. It's the essence of our being. Would you talk to them, Karen, about what the soul is, how we define it in our model, and how we use it?
Those are all big and great questions. Soul is our life force, our inner essence within. To me, it's like the North Star guiding our lives in a purposeful way. Soul, Roger will always teach that soul is the energy force that carries our reason for being here on this planet at this time. And so when we are in that space of soulfulness or consciousness, we are living in a fulfilled way, and that is how we are meant to live as human beings, from a place, we believe, from a place of the soul. And so the work when I am doing women's group work, simply getting in touch with your soul is often a great first step. How do I access my soul? Just like our parts are unique, our soul is unique. And our soul speaks to us in different ways. So how Ryan's soul shows up in his life is going to be different, could be similar in some ways, but different in other ways of how my soul shows up in my life. I access my soul easiest when I'm out in nature, the wilderness, when I'm able to be in a space of quietness, and I'm able to slow down. And all these subpersonalities, their voices can be so loud that it can be pretty tricky to hear your soul at times. And the soul, a lot of the women I work with as well, they often comment on what they've taken from this work is that the soul is the space where you're able to get above these consuming emotions or things that can feel like are over, that can just feel really big. And you're like, how am I going to get clarity on that? The soul can be the one that has this bird's eye view of what's going on in your life and be that meditative witness of who and what you're here to do. So I think that's how I would introduce, is how I would introduce soul.
Yes, and the soul is the connection that we have to our wholeness. Mm-hmm. That, yes, we have parts, we have subpersonalities, and they all have their own tangential perspective, and they all have their own self, right? Their own sub-self. And yet, if we were just subpersonalities, there would never be any cohesiveness. There would never be any integrativeness.
Mm-hmm.
There would never be any bringing back together. There would be relationship. There would be compromise. There would be competition. There would be subpersonalities at loggerheads trying to say, I want to control behavior. No, I want to control behavior. I want a divorce. No, I want to stay married. You know, that they would still do their thing.
Yes.
Sometimes they just tolerate each other. You know, in my dissertation, I created 3 categories of subpersonalities, how they work together. Mm-hmm. Competition, cooperation, toleration. When we're talking about competition, it's like, who's going to be the dominator?
Yeah.
You know, which parts, and that's when you're just living a self-directed life. You're not living a soul-directed life. It's just a matter of what Friedrich Nietzsche calls the will to power. It's like, who's going to get the will and who's going to powerfully manifest it through life? Who's going to win? Mm-hmm. If the mean jerk wins, then I'll be a mean jerk my whole life. If the loving softie wins, I'll be a loving softie. If the athlete wins, I'll be a marathon runner. You see how this goes? Yes. If a few of them take the forefront, they'll cooperate and they'll share the energy. So we have cooperation, which is like, hey, we have a common goal here. We both, this subpersonality and that subpersonality, we both, you know, we want somewhat similar things. We can see how we can work together. Mm-hmm. You know, whether maybe it's a caregiver and a lover, or maybe it's a mother and a friend, right? Mm-hmm. These different subpersonalities. Then toleration is more like this. Hey, listen, I don't want anything to do with you, but I know you're there, and I don't want to be bothered to like somehow get in a fight. So, you know, I'm just gonna be like, you know, I'm just gonna be tolerating you. You know, that just for those of you listening, I'm holding my nose, kind of putting my arm up. I'm like, I guess I'll put up with you. The competition is really a huge part of this, and most people can, if you just take a minute to imagine a time in your life where you had 2 conflicting perspectives, 2 conflicting emotions, you can see how we're not always unified in terms of what we want, and we're often not, and how that arises within us. I tell people, if you were a single voice, life would be easy. You would never have to think about your decisions. You'd just do what you do. You'd never think about other options. You just do what you wanted to do because you're one subpersonality doing one thing. You're just one whole thing. But because we have subpersonality, that makes life complex. That brings about uniqueness of these different parts. Sometimes it brings about conflict. Sometimes it brings about joy and celebration. It brings about all sorts of things. So the soul, though, is where we get beyond cooperation, we get beyond toleration, and we get beyond competition. We get into deep, meaningful connection. We get into what Roger calls a soul-directed life. Mm-hmm. Now, all of a sudden, it's not just about the will to power. It's not just about getting by, surviving, or functioning as a basic self. It's about thriving as a soul in meaning and connection. And that's where people deeply engage with the non-tangible aspects of human existence. Mm-hmm. The reason we call it self, soul, spirit is because we mean it. Spirit and soul are real.
Yes.
They are terms that we take as actual, that the soul has been established for millennia, and that the spirit is the source of the soul, and that if we're living in a soul-directed way, these subpersonalities are being directed by the soul in terms of how we live our lives overall. Mm-hmm. Now, Roger always says the soul doesn't have to get involved with whether you're going to have a hot fudge sundae or a Slurpee, or whether you're going to buy a Gatorade or a Pepsi. You know, in essence, the soul's not involved in the mundane decisions all the time. Now, the soul might get involved and say, I don't want to be treating my body this way. Mm-hmm. But that's a lifestyle choice. Yeah. The soul doesn't always get involved in the little minutia of every second of our life and how we live. The subpersonalities can handle that. Mm-hmm. The soul is for the essence, for the intention, and ultimately for the connection to spirit. Mm-hmm. Because the spirit is the source of the soul.
And the soul, we like to say the soul is our being and our parts are the doing. And so that connection between our soul and parts, one important piece to that is that it's not the soul having this power over. I know some women I've worked with, they don't love the word direction. Like they must have had some experience where that felt like this power over dynamic. And it's not about the soul being like, you part can't do that. It's about this collaboration with the soul guiding, and then the parts enacting what this purpose is, this meaning is, this soul-directed life, what that looks like.
The soul is not an authoritarian.
Yes, it's not an authoritarian.
Quick interjection here. It's not quite accurate to say that the soul can't be an authoritarian. In fact, I've seen in some clients that their souls join in with the self-destructive or destruction towards others in behaviors that can be quite chaotic. See, the point is that the soul is the source of free will. So the soul has a choice. If the soul chooses the chaos and destruction, that's the soul's choice. In other cases, the soul just hasn't quite woken up yet or isn't strong enough to overpower the other parts. But in all cases, the soul is the seat of free will and choice. Therefore, the soul is the proactive ability to engage life from a deep place of direction. The soul is our essence, our being. And so as an essence, I have the right to input to my decisions, to input to my behavior. I have the right to say, I want this, I don't want that.
Yes.
Because I'm the source. Now, that might mean sometimes that certain parts do get shut down from a place of power within. So we got to differentiate power over from power within. So there's power over, which is I'm doing things by force. I'm doing things by tyranny. I'm doing things by this sinister power over structure. There's power within, which is I'm doing things from prosperity. I'm doing things from source. I'm doing things from deep connection. And that's a place of boundaries sometimes. And it's also a place of direction. And it's also a place of collaboration where the parts get to petition to the soul. Hey, would you let me do this? Right? But those parts, there will be parts that won't cooperate with the soul in some people. Some people have saboteurs. Some people have depressed self-destructors. Some people have parts that do not want to cooperate with the soul. Now, I've met clients that have parts that they all want to cooperate. What a cool win-win.
Yeah,
right?
That's fun.
Yet there are people who have parts that don't want to cooperate. And that's where you get into power within and you get into boundaries. Then there's power with, which is you and I, we're doing a podcast. We both are doing this as a team. And we both, if you said to me, hey, let's do this, that as a partner, I'm listening and I'm collaborating. And I say, okay, would you be open to this too? And we're negotiating. That's power with, right?
Yeah.
So those are the different forms of power. We can do power with the parts, yet the soul has the ultimate power within.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's it's an honoring system. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you said is important, though, that we don't treat the soul as a dictator. We treat the soul as an essence source, as a beautiful director, if the soul wants to be. Now, some people don't know how to connect to their souls, and so therefore the soul is dormant in terms of connection. And it takes a lot of practice just to feel if they even have a soul, let alone direct in there. It's like, I don't even know if I have a soul. How am I going to direct my life from my soul? So that's where the non-judgment comes in of our model. It's not good or bad. It's a process of learning. Some people come to counseling just to live a functional, self-directed life. I've worked with teenagers who aren't quite ready to live from their souls. Who knows when they will be, right? Maybe later. And they come in. And it's like, hey man, like, I hate my parents. And they just always want to control me. And I'm 17, and I just want to hang out and smoke weed or whatever, right? Yeah. And so for them, it's about, how do I function as an individual? And for them, it's about, here's the parts of me that don't function or get into dysfunction, or here's the parts of me that get into destruction, or here's the parts of me that get into addiction. And so the work becomes about, how do I become a functioning member of civilization in a way that feels good to me, not just because mom and dad want me to. So, you're supporting them finding their independence as a self. That's not soul work. You're in the trenches doing self work. And that needs to be honored as it stands on its own as a valid piece of work. Now, so that's why in self, soul, spirit, we have room for the self work. to become functional. We have room for the soul work to become deeply directed.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think if you feel it's appropriate, we can now touch on spirit.
Yeah, I think we're ready to go there.
Now, Karen is going to launch on spirit. Karen has been doing spirit work her whole life. So I want to hear what you have to say about it. Yeah.
Well, to connect soul to spirit, I visualize that soul is like a piece of a fabric that's created from the fabric of spirit. And spirit, just like self, just like soul, is very unique to the individual. So we don't come at spirit as saying we have a certain religion you need to follow or a certain dogma or practice you need to follow. We come in with also the mentality that it's unique to the individual, their connection to spirit. For me personally, I feel very connected. I already talked about it in our first podcast, to a Mother Earth spirit. I feel also deeply connected to Jesus, the spirit and essence of Jesus as my higher power. Roger will use that term often. Who is your higher power? And spirit to me is, my experience of spirit is pure love, pure peace, and this greater guidance when my soul is longing for this connection greater than me, to say, hey, I am this unique individual, and how do I also connect to the greater good of the world and what is happening globally? Or it just expands the work into a way, way bigger masterpiece. And spirit is just the creme de la creme, why we're here.
And you do so much spirit work with the women and the people that you work with. How do you help them find spirit for themselves?
And we mentioned this in our last podcast, the wilderness quest, I believe, is a really foundational tool and space to be able to connect to spirit. I took a client out who didn't necessarily have that connection yet, and just having this approach of vulnerability and surrender, she encountered spirit out there and her own connection to spirit. It wasn't me saying, hey, you need to connect to Jesus, or hey, you need to connect to Mother Earth. It was her connecting to that greater power. And my experience of spirit is that greater power is love. That greater power is ease. That greater power is, it's going to be okay. And that greater power is, what if really the essence of this whole world is love? And love can feel like such a hard word to grasp at times, or it can feel like this Valentine's Day sentiment. To connect to that love, however, is like the greatest force on earth.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Yeah, for me, love is God, love is spirit, love is creator. That's also why I love Jesus, because Jesus is love. And that's why I connect with him as my higher power, as God to me.
Yeah.
And the important part of what Karen is saying, one of the many important parts, I should say, is that we all have our path to connecting with that creator source. And I published a paper on soul and universal spirit with the International Journal of Jungian Psychology a couple months ago. And basically, what I argue in that paper is that we see that we have a soul through the non-tangible aspects of our existence and through the process of nature, which is not totally reducible to mechanism. So evolution, for example, the process where organisms complexify and they create new ways of engaging, that can't just be reduced to algorithm or being a natural selection process. That's a part of it, is the natural selection process. And there's also the creative adaptation, the unquantifiable aspect of evolution, what Stuart Kaufman talks about, a theoretical biologist, as the bubbling forth of the biosphere, where possibilities and actualities just continue to bubble forth and co-create. And there is a creative process to nature that comes from soul, and that ultimately comes from spirit. Another way of getting at spirit is through consciousness. What is consciousness? Consciousness is intentionality. Consciousness is sensation. Consciousness is being. Consciousness is soul. Consciousness is life force. And the great question that many of us philosophers deal with is how did consciousness arise? You listen closely to that question and you hear an assumption, which is that it arose, that it came out of something else. And so a lot of materialistic people study consciousness from the perspective of how did it somehow pop out of the brain? How did we get complicated enough that all of a sudden we had feelings, that all of a sudden we had being, that all of a sudden we had essence? Now think about the funny contradiction of that statement, that we created our essence. We got complicated enough to have an essence. Your essence doesn't pop out of parts. Your essence creates the parts. Your essence creates the function. And so what we see in the universe is this progressive intelligibility where we can perceive the world and it has form to it. It has meaning to it. It is cohesive. We're not living in a random dissolving soup of entropy. We're not. We're living in a world of order. We're living in a world of meaning. We're living in a world of wholeness. You look outside and look at a tree. Whoa, that exists. That's a creation. Now you peel the layers back far enough, yeah, you can look at the molecular biology. Yeah, you can look at the evolutionary process. Yet what you can't explain is the creative part of all that. And that's where soul comes in. And so for me, spirit is the ultimate creator of soul. Spirit is the soul of the universe. Spirit is where our consciousness comes from. So that the creator, God, spirit, the great mystery, the great essence, whatever we want to call it, that's our source of creativity. That's our source of meaning. That's why the universe is arranged in such a way that it is sensible. Isn't it amazing when you look at the formation of galaxies, you see complexity and you see order and you see magnificent connections. You don't see random craziness. No. So the importance with this part is that people understand the metaphysics of the model is a deep engagement with the fact that consciousness is first. Consciousness doesn't come later. Self, soul, spirit, and Roger has nailed this into my brain. Consciousness first, consciousness first, consciousness first. And I had spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours with him trying to understand that. And I used to argue with him because I was trying to put consciousness in the brain. And he corrected me until I saw, and now I do my own research on it, that consciousness is the source. The other part of all that is that because consciousness is the source, when we connect to that source, we do find that meaningful process of spirit. So when we think of spirit, we're not talking about a fancy idea. We're not talking about some intellectual symbolism. We're not talking about an archetype. We're talking about a reality of consciousness. That everything's connected. That there's no such thing as space. We know this from quantum physics, that space doesn't exist. Karen is so in spirit that she doesn't even blink an eye when something synchronistic happens, because it's just like, yeah, that's what happens. That's the universe. It's all connected.
That's where we've come from.
And we know that now scientifically, that there is no such thing as space. If you have one particle that's spin up and another particle that's spin, it will automatically be spin down, even if it's light years apart. There's an equation that proves that. So the point is that once you lose space, you also lose time. Once you lose time, you realize that everything is one. You realize that everything is connected. You realize that there's no such thing as separation. We have boundaries as organisms where we contact our environments, yet we're all part of the same consciousness. We're all part of the same connected being.
It would be really great, Ryan, if we could give an example of a interaction in our own lives between soul and spirit.
Awesome, you go first.
I get that question a lot in the women's groups I run, is that a lot of women are like, how do I differentiate that inner voice, that knowing voice that's like, this is what I'm meant to do, from my spirit connection? And I think that is a great question to explore, because those voices can be really symbiotic and can feel really similar.
Awesome.
In my own experience.
All right, go for it.
So do you have an example right off?
I want you to go first.
Okay, I'll go first. So, one example of my soul coming in very clearly in my life to direct my life. So going back to the soul part of our model, when I was in seminary, I heard a voice clearly when I was working on my thesis to say, you are not meant to be here. You are meant to leave and go pursue this isn't your path. Spirit came into that equation, or that time in my life, to then my soul made the decision, and my parts took the action of actually leaving. And then spirit came in that time of my life and guided me in miraculous ways of not only reinforcing that you are hearing your soul. And so spirit gave me a lot of affirmation of, yes, keep going. And spirit guided me to the next step to take in my life, which at that time was to go pursue a different master's in educational psychology. And so it was a relationship between soul and spirit of guiding my life.
So how do you hear spirit?
Ooh, I hear spirit in different ways. Spirit to me feels more visceral. I feel it more in my body, whereas soul in my life has felt more like not necessarily an audible voice, but a voice telling me this certain direction. Spirit will come up in my life and I will literally feel it in my body of, is it this feeling of expansion or restriction? And so oftentimes really the way spirit shows up the most is through tears. I will feel this overwhelming sense of peace or love that it will fill my body so much that I feel such gratitude, I cry. And I know that is spirit coming into my life to remind me what is important and what is worth my focus on.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, I get spirit as voices, visions, symbols, feelings that come from like my energy field, right?
Yes.
Like around me.
Yeah.
I can feel these aspects of the field.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 17, I was getting sober.
Mm-hmm.
I had a subpersonality who's a compulsive force. And for that part of me, anything worth doing is worth overdoing. So the same part of me that got my Ph.D. in terms of driving force, same part of me that's so intense on this podcast. One thing that a lot of people think about me is, wow, Ryan's really intense.
It's just your philosopher teacher.
It's all of me.
Well, it's all of you.
I don't do anything mildly. My intensity is my driving energy so that I bring it.
I guess what I'm saying is that like your intensity when it comes through your 8-year-old boy can feel, your 6-year-old boy can feel very playful.
Yes, it feels
more
different.
than intense, but that playfulness is very, it has the
feeling,
driving, the driving feel of intensity.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Anyways, the point is that the same part of me that can get a PhD, that can be a hard driver on this podcast, that can be a go-getter, that can be a devoted husband, that aspect that anything worth doing is worth overdoing, can also get addicted to alcohol, can also get addicted to drugs, can also get addicted to all sorts of dysfunctional stuff. Mm-hmm. So I've been sober for 14 years, and addiction runs in my family, so we have it genetically as well. And we also have the compulsive driving phenomenon. My dad's a compulsive driver, my brother's a compulsive driver. The driving force of our being is our energy, and we'll talk about that probably in another podcast. The point that I'm making is, as a side tangent, is that I was in recovery, mm-hmm. and through my recovery I was engaging spirituality. And my spirituality I was finding in doing the 12-step program, surrendering to a higher power. That's where we get the word higher power. It's huge in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's huge in 12-step. I was doing my work. I was meditating. I was praying. I was seeking God actively. So I had a lot of spirit experiences early on. One of them was these more telepathic experiences. I was at the treatment center and I was sitting in the main room. My friend was in another building. So you'd walk outside and there'd be a gravel lot. The other building was about 50 yards away. I'm just sitting there inside, and all of a sudden I hear a voice, "Something's wrong with your friend." So I just walk outside, just follow spirit. I walk outside towards him. He comes out of the other building crying. His parents had just gotten a divorce.
Wow.
So the voice is validates some things for us, right? Is that everything is connected. There's no such thing as space. So things can travel instantly. Have you ever been thinking of someone and then all of a sudden they call you? Even if they're thousands of miles away, 100 miles away.
Well, this happens with us and Roger all the time.
Happens all the time.
Like on a weekly basis, Ryan and I will be meeting and Roger will call.
Yeah, just
it's
randomly.
like,
and like we haven't been talking to him before
yeah,
that.
we haven't been talking to him for a week and he
Yeah.
will call because we are connected energetically.
We are connected energetically. When you understand that there's no such thing as space, you understand that things don't need space to travel in the spiritual realm. That it's instant. That's everything is connected. Everything is instantaneous. That's where synchronicities come from. It's that we're tethered to spirit, which is outside of time and space. We live in the idea, in the form, in the evolutionary construct of space and time, yet in spirit, that stuff doesn't really exist. It's all just one big wholeness. So these experiences of spirit are tremendously important. It's no accident that this is the self-soul spirit model, because what we're looking at here is more than a model, Karen. What we're looking at here is life. And the goal with this model is to say, look, we're doing this based on observation and openness. Roger, being such a good scientist, he knew stuff about genetics 40, 50, 60 years ago that now people are just publishing and catching up on. It's been validated. Roger's been validated. Well, how did he do it? Observation, watching people, watching animals on the farm, thinking as a scientist, thinking as a philosopher, being shrewd, realizing that everyone's unique. Where could that come from? So chasing the trail and doing it inductively and deductively, doing it based on observation, doing it based on deductive logic, and seeing how we're not also robots. We're not just accidents from a chemical universe. And that's the other part that I think is so important and has been so damaging to our understanding of spirit is materialism. Now, a lot of people call it physicalism, but it's really the idea that you can reduce everything to physics and molecules and chemicals. And so part of what I tried to do in that paper is make an argument that said, actually, that doesn't even make sense logically. And here's why. Here's why we can't reduce our life to an accidental process that then over natural selection started making sense. Because we know this, you can't get something out of nothing. You can't get creativity out of non-creativity. You can't get love out of non-love. You can't get life out of non-life. So when people ask, how did life emerge from non-life? Again, it's the same question. How did consciousness emerge from non-consciousness? It's an assumption. So when we break the assumption and we ask a different question and say, what is consciousness, first of all? And then we see that consciousness is the source of life, is the source of energy, is the source of our spirit connection. I mean, for my philosopher, that's just so fun. That's just so cool. That's just so meaningful to me. And to be able to validate it through actual rigorous argument and seeing that what Roger created is not only tremendously meaningful to live, it holds up on a scientific and philosophical basis. That to me is just I geek out over that. That's that's my researcher. That's
Yes.
that's my philosopher. That's my teacher. That's my writer. That just I could teach a whole class on the metaphysics, the philosophy, and yet there's this other part that you bring, Karen, that is do the exercise, do the experiment, be with spirit, and that too is so important because we have to feel it, we have to taste it, we have to touch it in order to know it. We don't want it to just become a philosophy. We want it to be a lived philosophy,
A lived
an
experience.
embodied philosophy. So these experiences that we were sharing, whereas I'm bringing some of the scholarly stuff, I feel like these experiences that we're sharing are also to ground it as a real, a real actual experience, not just something that we think about, something that we feel about, something that we connect with.
Well, and what Ryan is showing is that this is not something we teach, we live it. We live it in our daily lives. We are aware of our parts and we take action and we do the work. We are like Ram Dass says, we're all just walking each other home, and that's what's so beautiful is that it's not like we're sitting over here being like, we have all the answers and we like have arrived. It's a journey. The idea of this being bigger than a model is this is our life. This is how we both show up in our daily.
1,000%. And the other idea of it being bigger than a model is that as our understanding grows, the model grows.
Yes.
So it's like if you have a closed structure, a model that says this is what it is.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, okay, that's stagnant. Self, soul, spirit is alive. So as new information comes in, as we have more experiences with our higher power, with Jesus, we also update our model.
Yeah.
We update, wow, this is also happening. We bring it in. When new science comes in on genetics, guess what? I put it in.
Yeah.
And I make sure that self and how we represent self in the model is being taught, is being updated with the newest science. When Roger often talks about the telescope, the James Webb telescope, as that continues to make discoveries that challenge and change our perspective of the universe, that goes into the cosmological understanding of self, soul, and spirit. As new information comes in on consciousness studies, on quantum physics. So the point is that Karen and I are the carriers of a torch, of a model that is growing, living, becoming, just like the universe is, just like we are. So we invite you to join us in the growing, living, and becoming of the model. That's the authentic process. For those of us that, the cool thing about this is everyone has a home here.
Yeah.
If you love philosophy, join the philosophical part of the model. If you love being in the actual mandala work, working with Karen, do that. If you love both, do both. See, the point is that as we live authentically, we understand who we are. If we have the spirit part, we do the spirit. Some of us come in genetically with the spiritual part. Other people do not have the spirit seeker genetically. That doesn't mean that their soul doesn't have the opportunity to encounter spirit. It just means that it's not a genetic inheritance within their mandala, that it's something that they might learn through life. Some people are natural mothers. It's like they know deep in their bones, I'm a mother. Some people are not natural parents. They have to learn how to be a mother or a father. And so when the kid comes, it's a process of adjustment of, okay, this isn't a natural part of who I am. I'm going to learn how to do it. Some people have a genetic part for wilderness. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll hand it back to you, Karen, is when we talk about genetics, it's important to realize we're not talking about a single gene for a single part. There are hundreds, sometimes thousands of genes that lead to one subpersonality, that make up that subpersonality's actual core and who they are and how they operate. There are networks of genetics that work together, that are being studied through computation and through testing, that are being elaborated on all the time. We have to understand when we teach self, when we teach genetics, this is a very complex process. And it deserves a lot of scientific attention, and it deserves to be seen as complex like it is. If we see it as, if somebody tells you there's a gene for your lover part, No, there's multiple genes. So that's just another tidbit from my teacher, so you know how the genetics work. So anyways, I'm done with that.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Good.
I feel like we've gone over self, soul, and spirit, and in the, like we said already in our podcast to come, we'll go deeper even into each one of those, as well as my favorite thing is to talk about the application. So how does this really make a difference in our lives? We'll share stories from our own lives.
Absolutely.
We'll have themes. I hope to bring other people on that have done this work as well and share how it's shown up in their own lives, and really to make this space a place where people really feel like they can connect and learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
Yeah.
We're going to have the best of all worlds.
So
We're going to
fun.
have the philosophy, the applications, the spirit.
Yes.
We'll do the spirit podcast. But right now we're laying the foundation.
Yeah.
Or I should say, right now we're laying the foundation so that all of those episodes make sense to the audience. So come on the journey with us. Stay up to date with the model and watch us as we do the deep dives. We share ourselves, we share each other, and we invite you into Self, Soul, Spirit. Our goal is to get at least one episode of the Self, Soul, Spirit podcast out a week. Remember, in the description is the website as well as the email address in case you'd like to contact us with your inquiries. Also, leave a comment, share with your friends and family. Let's get this podcast out to as big of an audience as possible so that the world can learn about the Self, Soul, Spirit model. Thanks for tuning in.